In the chaos of war, soldiers cling to anything that gives them an edge: better boots, a faster reload, a sharper knife. But sometimes, advantage comes from sheer ingenuity. That was the case with Corporal Tommy Henshaw, a quiet, wiry marksman from the English countryside whose homemade rifle scope turned him from the butt of his unit's jokes into a battlefield legend. It was early 1944. The Allies were grinding their way through Italy, and Henshaw was part of a British infantry regiment holding a battered ridgeline outside Cassino. Rain fell endlessly, turning trenches into cold mud baths. Supply lines were stretched, and equipment shortages were constant. Precision scopes, especially for snipers, were in short supply. Tommy Henshaw wasn't officially a sniper, just the regiment's best shot. A gamekeeper before the war, he had spent his youth tracking deer and foxes through the misty woods of Devon. He could judge distance by instinct and hit moving targets that others barely saw. But when he requested a proper sniper rifle with a factory scope, he was told there were none left. "Make do with what you've got," the quartermaster grunted. So Henshaw did exactly that. In the workshop tent behind the lines, surrounded by broken gear and abandoned weapon parts, Henshaw began tinkering. He scavenged a cracked pair of field binoculars, the brass tubing from an artillery sighting device, and even a piece of aircraft glass from a downed Spitfire. With the patience of a craftsman, he filed, fitted, and polished until the pieces aligned. The result looked crude: a long, mismatched contraption bolted awkwardly to his Lee-Enfield rifle. The lenses were uneven, and the housing was patched together with wire and epoxy. When his comrades saw it, they laughed. "Looks like a drainpipe glued to a broomstick." One private jeered. "Careful, Tommy," another said. "You'll blow your eye out before you hit anything." Even his commanding officer shook his head. "You'd better hope that thing doesn't explode in your face." But Henshaw didn't care. He tested his makeshift scope behind the lines, shooting at ration tins and helmets at varying distances. It took days of adjustment, but he slowly found the right alignment. By the time he was done, he could hit a helmet dead center from 800 yards, and that was before he fine-tuned it. The real test came weeks later. It was dawn when the German armored column appeared, a mix of half-tracks and panzers crawling up the valley below the British position. The air was cold and tense. Henshaw's unit had little in the way of anti-tank weapons, just a few PIAT launchers and some mortars. None of it could reach the enemy from that distance. The panzers stopped just outside effective range, positioning their guns to shell the ridge. If they got closer, the British defense would crumble. "Bloody hell, we'll be minced up here," muttered Sergeant Carter, squinting through his binoculars. Then Henshaw quietly spoke up. "I can see the lead tank's commander." Carter turned to him, incredulous. "At that distance? You must be joking." But Henshaw wasn't. Through his odd-looking contraption, he had a clear, if slightly distorted, view of the German Panzer IV. The commander stood half-exposed in the turret, scanning with his own binoculars. Henshaw adjusted his breathing. He remembered his father's words from years ago while hunting: "Let the world go still before you pull the trigger." The battlefield seemed to fade. He squeezed gently. The Lee-Enfield barked, echoing across the valley. A heartbeat later, the German commander's body jerked backward and disappeared into the turret. The tank lurched, halted, confusion spreading through the formation. "Holy hell," someone whispered. Henshaw worked the bolt smoothly, chambered another round, and fired again. This time he aimed lower, toward the driver's hatch. The second shot rang true. The Panzer shuddered, its treads grinding to a stop. The rest of the tanks hesitated, unsure what had happened. They were being hit from a range well beyond what any standard infantry rifle could manage. To them, it felt like an invisible sniper or hidden artillery gun. Henshaw fired a third time, this one at the open vision slit of another approaching vehicle. The bullet ricocheted inside, enough to make the crew panic and reverse. Within minutes, the column began retreating, dragging the disabled Panzer with them. The British line erupted in cheers. After the battle, the same soldiers who had mocked him gathered around his muddy trench. "Let's have a look at that bloody contraption," one said in awe. They passed his rifle around like a relic. The homemade scope, with its brass tubing and patched glass, was smeared with grime and rain, but it had proven deadlier than any issued optic. Even the officer who had dismissed it stood silent for a moment before nodding. "Well, Corporal Henshaw," he said finally, "seems you've just written the manual on British engineering." Word spread quickly. The story of the homemade sniper who took out a Panzer at 1,200 yards reached other units and even filtered up to headquarters. For weeks afterward, soldiers joked that the enemy tanks now feared Tommy's telescope. When an official inspection team arrived to see the weapon, they were stunned by its simplicity. The alignment was imperfect, and yet the results were undeniable. They took notes, sketches, and photographs, but Henshaw's exact method of construction, his small calibrations and field adjustments, remained his secret. He kept using the same rifle through the Italian campaign, continuing to score impossible hits, enemy spotters, machine gun nests, even a distant artillery observer. His comrades stopped laughing long ago. When the war ended, Tommy Henshaw returned home quietly. He never sought medals or recognition. His homemade scope went with him, disassembled and wrapped in oilcloth, tucked away in a wooden box. He returned to his old job as a gamekeeper, walking the same forests he had known since boyhood. To those who knew him, he was just a quiet man with a sharp eye and steady hands. Few knew that once, on a rain-soaked ridge in Italy, he had stopped a Panzer with nothing but ingenuity and courage. Years later, when a young historian tracked him down for an interview, Henshaw showed him the scope. The brass had tarnished, and the glass was foggy with age. "Looks crude, doesn't it?" Henshaw said, smiling faintly. But it did the job. When the historian asked what made him trust such a makeshift piece of gear, Henshaw paused. "It's not about the scope," he said quietly. "It's about the man behind it, and whether he believes it'll work." In the grand scope of history, Tommy Henshaw's name never made it into the textbooks. He wasn't a general or a decorated hero. But among the veterans who served with him, his story became something more, a legend whispered around campfires and pubs long after the war ended. His homemade scope symbolized the very heart of wartime ingenuity, the idea that courage, skill, and creativity can turn even the simplest tools into instruments of victory. While others relied on factory-made precision, Henshaw trusted his hands, his instincts, and his belief that a man could make something extraordinary from the ordinary. And on that muddy ridge in Italy, with enemy armor closing in, he proved it. The soldiers who once laughed at his contraption never laughed again. Because they knew, when the chips were down, and the world seemed lost, it was one man's crazy idea that saved them all.